Thank you, Rachel.
Is there a connection that you can discern between the type of work that ACORN does and the people who started this campaign against them, which has now, of course, mushroomed into a national event?
You know, ACORN's made a lot of enemies in the 40 years it's been doing organizing work in America's inner cities. Banks that they fought, insurance companies that they fought, low-wage companies that pay poverty wages, and companies that provide payday, rip-off predatory loans. In fact, ACORN was the first group in the country to warn about the predatory lending. And if people had listened to ACORN, if the policymakers had listened to ACORN when they were warning about this, we wouldn't have the foreclosure and mortgage meltdown that we've had in the last couple of years. So ACORN's made a lot of enemies, and when they've registered voters in low-income neighborhoods, disproportionately those people vote for Democrats, although ACORN itself is nonpartisan. So the Republican Party in a lot of parts of the country has been against ACORN, and they've been trying to destroy ACORN for many years. Karl Rove, as we now know, was responsible for starting a campaign to try to get the U.S. attorneys to prosecute ACORN for voter fraud. And when the U.S. attorneys like David Iglesias said there was no voter fraud, he fired him because he wanted to get rid of ACORN. So the media have picked up on this theme that ACORN is corrupt and ACORN's involved in voter fraud, when the reality is that there was absolutely no voter fraud that ACORN participated in. But you'd never know that by reading the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or other mainstream media.
Well, give me some sense of the distance between the truth of what happened with ACORN and the charges that led to them being smeared as a voter fraud organization and the way that it's actually covered. What's the distance between the way the voter registration stuff is talked about and what actually happened?
Okay, I'll give you an example. We looked at 600 stories, every story about ACORN in 15 major media outlets. And what we discovered was that in almost all of those stories, voter fraud was the major theme. ACORN has been doing this grassroots organizing for 40 years, and they've gotten some attention, but the attention really peaked during the presidential election last year when John McCain and Sarah Palin attacked ACORN for voter fraud. What really happened was that ACORN was registering voters in low-income neighborhoods, and ACORN would go around to neighborhoods and supermarkets and other places and have people fill out voter registration forms. In a handful of cases, people would write phony names, for example, Mickey Mouse or Donald Duck, and whenever ACORN found that one of those forms had a phony name on it, they did what they were required to do by law, which is to report the abuse, report the problem. So when ACORN did that, they weren't engaged in voter registration fraud. They were following the law. But then what happened is that in many parts of the country, the Republican attorney general and district attorneys would accuse ACORN of making those phony claims, of making those phony names, instead of saying that ACORN was, in fact, doing their job. So in almost every story about voter fraud, the mass media, not just the right-wing media, but the mainstream media, failed to report that ACORN was abiding by the law. It failed to report that not one person in this entire country voted who actually signed one of those forms in a misleading way. So there was absolutely no voter fraud. There was some voter registration problems which ACORN reported. But despite that, John McCain, Sarah Palin, Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, and the rest of the right-wing media and the mainstream media, unfortunately, picked up on this notion that ACORN is responsible for wide-scale voter fraud. And that's what you're seeing on the houses of the Senate and the House, on the floors of the House and Senate this last week. You're seeing people basically following up on these misleading charges against ACORN.
The more that I look into the misleading nature of the charges against ACORN, not just from people from whom I expect misleading charges, but from reporters and mainstream media, people in the mainstream media who ought to know better, the angrier I get. And I think that we're going to be covering the lies about ACORN over a number of shows over upcoming days, including talking specifically about this latest scandal, about this entrapment video with people posing as a pimp and a prostitute. Professor Dreyer, I hope that you might be able to come back and join us again as we continue to talk about this story and try to understand how this went so off the rails over the next few days.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Peter Dreyer is a professor at Occidental College. He's co-author of an important new study about ACORN, which we are posting a link to at our website, rachel.msnbc.com. ooh, this story gets me mad.